Alright, in this lecture I want to show you what you can do with media queries in Sass. Now first of all, remember that when using the SCSS syntax, every CSS style sheet is also a valid SCSS style sheet. So this already tells you that you can use all the media queries that you use in CSS the exact same way in SCSS. So you could go ahead and add some kind of media query here on top level, and that would be fine because that's also valid CSS syntax. But of course, Sass is a good guy, so it's going to make your life a bit easier again, because the media queries in Sass actually have one more feature. Because when using Sass or SCSS, we can nest our selectors. And similarly, we can also use nested media queries. So you could add a media query inside our body tag or inside any other selector we want to use. And then the preprocessor is going to go ahead and bubble that media query up to the top level while gathering all the selectors on the way, so that you have the correct media query which applies to the correct selectors in the end. But in the CSS code, it's then again on the top level. Now let's make this a bit clearer by looking at two concrete examples. Now first of all, when we look at our web page, this looks fine on this resolution, but when we open up the developer console using F12 in Firefox and also using F12 in Chrome, and we go to this responsive design mode over here, then we can see that our whole content, our whole text, just flows out of the actual screen. And this is because we set the size of our content section to a static 960 pixels. So let's jump back into our SCSS code and fix this problem. So we're going to scroll down to where we have our content section, our main section more specifically, because that has this width which is set to 960 pixels at the moment. And then we can add a media query right here. So we can say add media, only screen, and maximum width is supposed to be 960 pixels. So we're targeting screens with 960 pixels width or less. And then we're not going to set this width as we did above, so we're going to say width auto. And if you want, you can set the maximum width to this content width. So now we can hit save, and we now have this nested media query inside our main selector, which is not possible in CSS. So let's jump over to the generated CSS code to see what this compiles to. So down here where we have our main, we now see this media query right here. Now these lines are indented, but you can see that they're not part of the actual main selector body. Because in CSS you can only have these top level media queries right here, and you can see that all the selectors we need have been inserted inside this media query correctly. So let's hop back to the browser. So you can see that now the text is being wrapped correctly at the end of the screen. So when we resize this, the text is also resized. And once we hit the 960 pixel breakpoint, then we can see that it doesn't resize anymore there. So the size stays 960 pixels on all screens that are large enough, but for smaller screens it's going to adjust accordingly. Alright, so far so good. Let's hop back to our SCSS. So let's quickly take a look at another example and just add a media query inside our body selector. And I want the font size to be larger on these small screens. So I'm going to use the same media query again. And then I'm going to say the font size is supposed to be 125%. So again, when we look at our CSS file, we can now see that right below our body selector, we now have this media query as well, which again has all the correct selectors inside it and is on top level. So again, it's not inside the actual styles inside the body selector. Alright, good. So you can use media queries wherever you like in the nested SCSS or Sass files. And the preprocessor is going to go ahead and add all the correct selectors for you inside the top level media query that is required for the CSS code. So this makes it much easier to define your media queries where you need them, and also to change them at the same place where the parent selector is. So when you want to change anything about the body styles, you can do that right here, and also any media queries you have are right here for you, so that you don't have to look for them, but instead you can just change them wherever your actual selector is as well. Now, of course, I want to mention that this is not a responsive design approach as you would use it in practice. where you should use some kind of framework to really handle all the different screen sizes, resolutions, and so on. Now in the next lecture, we're going to see how we can actually combine media queries and mixins to make this approach a bit more sophisticated and see how we could actually also create our own framework for things like this. So see you in the next lecture.